Hello, everybody. That was the sound to start this edition of Ask the Author, our 30-minute series to present the results, the findings of the latest ITF reports. My name is Michael Claude. I'm the head of communications here at ITF, and it's a great pleasure to have you. I can see the room is still filling up, so I'll do a little bit of talking before we actually get into the substance matter. We are talking about electric vehicles, and the EV revolution is in full swing, at least in developed countries. In the European Union, 21-something%, so 1 in 4 cars, 1 in 5 cars that is registered is an electric vehicle. Just 5 years ago, the figure was, I think, like 2%, so there's a clear move in that direction. And if things go well, we'll be where Norway is today, where about 80% of all newly registered cars are electric. But then electric congestion is still congestion, as some wise person said. So the question is, maybe, are we looking at the right kind of electrification here? Are we missing a crucial point when we focus on electric cars as a substitute for fossil fuel powered cars? So these are the questions that are examined in our report: shifting the focus, smaller electric vehicles for sustainable cities. And as you can already guess from the title what the answer is, but we will hear a little bit about the evidence that's behind the title. And I'm delighted to have with me my colleagues Andrea, Papu, Carrone, and Joshua Paternina Blanco of the ITF, who can switch on their camera so we can see them, because they'll be doing the talking. They are the lead authors of this report, and they will take about 10 minutes to take you through their findings, and then 20 minutes are reserved for your questions, because this is called Ask the Author, and it's your opportunity to question some of the findings, to ask questions that are not covered, to ask about the evidence. And please do so by using the Q&A function in Zoom. So there's a little icon with Q&A. If you can put in your questions there, that will help us manage them. Don't use the chat, please. The chat's not so easy to manage and to put questions, so use the Q&A. You can already put in your questions during the presentation. That way we can launch directly into the discussion. Don't wait until it's over. And then we'll all be a little wiser at the end, I hope. So Joshua and Andrea, if you're there, I hope you're there. Can you turn off your camera so we can see you? You can start the presentation and take us through the findings of shifting the focus, small electric vehicles for sustainable cities. Over to you.
Of course, Michael, thank you very much. And just to confirm, can you see us?
All good.
Perfect, thank you. And so welcome everyone. As Michael very well introduced, at the ITF, we're calling for a shift of focus in vehicle electrification policies in cities. And to tell you a little bit more about these and the latest results of this publication, I'm first going to highlight specifically what is it that we mean by shift of focus. Then my colleague Andrea is going to mention some of the sustainability and energy impacts of such a shift. And I'm going to conclude by highlighting some of the main policies that can support this shift in focus. And just to start, shifting the focus of what? Well, we think that in electrifying vehicles, cities need to change the focus of what is it that they understand by what a vehicle is. Now, we know that oftentimes when people think about electric vehicles, they think about electric cars, such as these Tesla models that we have on the screen. And while electrifying larger private cars is important, we see in 2020 that there was an average fleet of around 10 million electric cars around the world. This number paled in comparison with the more than 300 million electric vehicles that existed there, according to IEA values. And so shifting the focus of what is it that we understand by vehicles can allow thinking about and leveraging on the potential of emerging vehicle types, smaller vehicles such as microcars, but also electric cargo bikes, electric shared bikes, electric buses, electric cargo bikes, and electric emerging innovative last mile logistics vehicles for more sustainable cities.
Thank you very much, Joshua, and I will be running you through the sustainability and energy impacts of this shift. Sustainable and electric mobility needs to be small and shared. Why? Because the like-for-like replacement of conventional vehicles by their electric counterpart, without changing their patterns of use, addressing their increasing size, or improving their low occupancy, will limit the role that electric vehicles will play in making cities more sustainable. So in this report, what we first compare is the sustainability impacts of two fully electric scenarios. 100% electrification, but that follows two different electrification pathways. The first one, the like-for-like pathway, assumes that vehicles with internal combustion will be just replaced by their electric powered equivalent, while the broader uptake relies on an electric transition that involves mode shifts to emerging smaller vehicle types and shared use cases. So to assess the impacts and to compare the outcomes of these two scenarios, we rely on the ITF, Urban Passenger and Freight Agent-Based Model. What is it? It's a detailed transport simulation and optimization model that represents a typical day of passenger and freight travel in a mid-sized European city. This is an in-house model that has already been developed and used in the previous studies that you can see on the screen right now and are able to reach to them through those QR codes. Where in this previous studies, we have measured the impact on the curb, on the street space use, on the road safety and emissions. This study takes a step forward and upgrades this model to measure the impacts on electricity demand and charging infrastructure. So what do we find when comparing the sustainability impacts of these two electric scenarios that follow different electrification pathways? So first, we find that the broader uptake pathway can deliver safer streets when it's supported by segregated infrastructure, regulated access, use, and speeds. In this case, the broader uptake pathway can reduce the risk of conflicts between pedestrians and cars and micromobility users and cars by 40% and 60% respectively compared to the like-for-like pathway. It also, the broader uptake pathway, it also requires 1/3 less of street space use, 1/3 less of battery capacity and the respective battery materials required to manufacture those batteries, and 1/3 less public charging points for electric vehicles. Finally, it also requires 15% less electricity demand. But city authorities must understand today what's the charging infrastructure requirements and the electricity demand that will be linked to their envisioned electric mobility futures. So this study takes a second path where it presents the implication on electricity demand and charging infrastructure needs by 2030 for 3 different degrees of vehicle electrification ambition. For this brief presentation today, I will just be referring to 2030 high ambition. This scenario assumes that by 2030, the fleets of shared mobility will be fully electric, that half of the bus public transport fleets will be also electric, and that roughly 30% of the private vehicles and light commercial vehicle fleets will also be electric. The first finding that we see is that electricity demand peaks overnight. And that is because most shared modes, public transport, bus public transport, and freight carriers charge within the depots overnight. If we now focus on private passenger modes, these vehicles would charge either at home, at destination, which is at work, or off-street parking lots, and on-street public chargers that could either be slow chargers or fast chargers. The charging profile has 2 peaks, a night peak and a day peak. And the second finding that we like to highlight today is that home charging represents 67% of the daily private passenger electricity demand, and that this amount could imply a 10% increase relative to today of household residential electricity consumption. Finally, we see that the deployment of public chargers must keep up as electric vehicle uptake increases. But also, as electric vehicle uptake increases, the number of public chargers per electric car will decrease. And our finding is that this number decreases from 12 public chargers per 1,000 electric cars to 9 as we raise our electrification ambition. Finally, public chargers needs are unevenly distributed in space, and denser areas require more public chargers.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for highlighting those results of the report. And so what are the policy recommendations based on these results that can take us here further towards shifting this focus? We have three main recommendations modeled in three main segments. The first one is that it's important that authorities facilitate the uptake of alternatives and smaller electric vehicles. And this is through various tools. The first type of tool is that authorities build the right infrastructure. But when we're talking about infrastructure, it doesn't mean charging infrastructure. It actually means micromobility lanes, segregated spaces, but also street infrastructure that can reduce or facilitate the reduction of the speed of larger vehicles for a safe coexistence of all relevant modes. Beyond infrastructure, it's also essential that authorities approve for use emerging vehicle types and regulate all vehicles so that they can coexist safely in city street. When we talk about homologating or approving for use, we talk about things like understanding the characteristics of emerging vehicles and trying to regulate and allow for their use wherever it is safe for it to be done so. But then when we call for the regulations of all vehicles, it is because it's important that all vehicles, especially larger ones, are regulated further so that their travel speeds, for instance, and their vehicle characteristics are levier for road safety rather than a barrier. And then finally, we also highlight the importance of making smaller and emerging vehicle types attractive and affordable, both for passenger and for freight. For passenger, this means that authorities could consider having subsidies for the uptake of these vehicles, especially for lower income groups, so that the electric transition can be also fair and just. For freight, it also means facilitating the financing of acquiring electric fleets, for instance, by facilitating loans. But then the second big recommendation is that authorities should support widespread electric shared mobility of alternative vehicles. And to be able to do this, it's important that authorities deploy a wide array of tools to, on the one hand, decrease the attractiveness of the use of private vehicles, especially larger ones, while also fostering the electrification of shared modes. Tools can be, for instance, the use of low emission zones or other measures that make the use of non-electric private vehicles less attractive. Other measures can include facilitating or reducing the cost of parking for electric shared fleets, especially in city centers. But beyond the promotion or the decrease in attractiveness of other non-electric modes, authorities should also make sure, through various policies, that the electrification of shared mobility goes in hand and is a complement rather than a competition for public transport. And some very specific measures can help in this way. For instance, building or fostering and tendering emerging shared micromobility stations around public transport points can be a way of making sure or facilitating the complementarity of these modes. And finally, it's essential that authorities think about providing on and off street charging for passenger and freight. And now in the screen, you can see on-street public charging point. And this is, of course, very important. As Andrea mentioned, with the results, public charging points are going to be necessary, especially for passenger activities in city centers, where it's very difficult to find the space for having off-street charging. But then off-street charging is still going to be essential, and promoting forms of depot charging for public transport and for freight, as well as for shared mobility, and also developing ways and helping, for instance, workplaces develop their own off-street charging infrastructure is going to be essential. Finally, just based on what Andrea just presented, even though it's important to focus on charging availability in city centers, especially for public charging, in peri-urban areas, it's also going to be important to have proper deployment of these charging points so that, again, all territories are covered. And using licensing or contractual mechanisms for making sure that charging point providers have both points in attractive and in less attractive financially locations could be a way forward to this end. And so these are the three main policy recommendations that we have. Now, based on our report, we are very happy to take any question that you may have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. The two of you, Joshua and Andrea. That was hugely interesting, and you had to race through it a little bit because there's lots of stuff in there. Let me go straight away to the questions because a lot have come in already. And let me start with one topic that sort of briefly raised its head, but that's, I think, quite interesting, which is about the safety, about the road safety side. And it comes from Sora Bodidi, who asks, EVs are safer than traditional cars? 3 question marks. What about the road safety side? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Of course, thank you very much for that question. And if I may, I am going to start with answering, and then Andrea can complement. But that's an essential question. EVs are vehicles, and vehicles are as safe as the system where they evolve can be. Actually, this question on road safety is the reason because of which we started our presentation by first highlighting the road safety results of what a broader uptake could be. This means that, again, if we use a broader uptake, where we have smaller vehicles, where larger vehicle sizes, even if they are electric, reduce their participation in mobility needs, then we can have safer systems. But this requires the right infrastructure. Electric vehicles are not safer as ICE ones if the system in which they are is not safe.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. And if it just might reflect on 2 other things, it's for safety considerations, it's fundamental to take into account size and speed. So here when we're comparing the broader uptake, we're leveraging from the electrification pathway to actually include smaller vehicle types, which typically will go at slower speeds. So smaller vehicles, lower weight and lower speed would be crucial to reduce the safety impacts. Further than that, infrastructure segregation, as we point out in our report, has an effective, it's reflected in the numbers, how it reduces the safety conflicts.
Thanks very much. So replacing electric ICE cars with electric cars doesn't do much safety-wise, but it's about weight and about speed. A question from Konrad Otto Zimmermann, who asks about the incentives. You know, it's all very fine that we should be using smaller vehicles, but in fact, SUVs and sort of bigger vehicles are the thing that people buy. So what incentives can governments set to actually create the trend that you point out is the way we should be going?
Thank you for that question. I believe that question could keep us here for hours. But if I need to answer very quickly, I think it's important that we come back to the previous question on safety. it is not going to be possible in many cities around the world for people to adopt smaller vehicles if the city streets and the mobility system in the cities that they are not safe and don't allow for the safe use of these vehicles. So definitely reducing larger vehicle speed, but providing the right infrastructure are going to go a long way in facilitating the uptake of smaller vehicles as an alternative and a realistic and safe alternative to larger ones. Now, beyond these, I believe, and in our report, we highlighted various disincentives that authorities can use to make, comparatively speaking, smaller and emerging electric vehicles more attractive. And some of these disincentives is using forms, for instance, of road pricing that take into account vehicle sizes as part of their components, so that not only you create safe systems where it's possible and likely to use smaller and emerging vehicles, but that you also make systems where using larger ones is not as attractive.
Yeah, and just another point on incentives of purchase for electric vehicles. Today, most countries do not have incentives for EV purchase that are focused on size. Neither some countries, yes, have a cap for pricing, for purchase price. But of course, including size into incentives for purchase would be a good strategy if we want to look into smaller vehicles.
Thanks very much. And I always chuckle a little bit at the term of emerging vehicles. Makes me think of some Nessie coming out of Loch Ness or a submarine emerging out of the water. Anyway, here's another question from Graham Parkhurst, who asks about the overall impact of this, what you're suggesting, on the overall transport greenhouse gas emissions impact. Because, as he says, while the proposal makes a lot of sense, most transport-related greenhouse gas emissions, in fact, come from interurban, suburban, sub-regional journeys, not so much from the city itself. So, what are we talking in terms of scale? How much can this address?
So this is a good question. I think if we take into account the macro perspective of how is it that electric vehicles can facilitate reaching wider environmental goals. Now, this report, of course, focuses on cities. I believe that having a shift towards smaller vehicles can accelerate electrification and thereby reducing urban greenhouse gas emissions. Why? Because even in the countries where we have the most ambitious electrification policies, because these electrification policies address mainly private cars, then due to affordability questions, due to the high cost of and the replacement rate of larger cars, electrification is still a little bit slow. And so if we develop contexts where smaller vehicles, which are less costly, which are more affordable, but also can already be used in many cities, especially denser ones, for electrification policies, then it's going to be easier and faster for people to adopt an electric vehicle. Electric vehicles don't necessarily need to be electric cars for contributing to the wider environmental objectives that we have. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it just a short comment if you want to, and if we think outside of urban areas. So this, as Joshua presented, this report it's focused on cities and urban areas, taking into account differences in central areas of these urban areas, but also in peri-urban areas, where we see that the impact is of such a shift to smaller vehicles could be higher due to the high dependence on four-wheelers. This phenomenon of dependence on four-wheelers is also, we also see that in regional transport. Still, this is something that we will continue to explore. We see that there's a great potential to expand this within regional transport, but we also foresee some other challenges that are in respect to infrastructure and to some extent charging and feasibility of long trips to be made with smaller vehicles. So it's something that we will continue to explore. It's a bit outside of the scope of this specific project that has been evaluating urban areas.
Thanks. Maybe just a footnote for the practical example that here in Paris, where we're based, actually there exists a scheme where the city or city-sponsored leases electric bicycles, very robust electric bicycles to people in the suburban area. At the same time, they have created a system of bicycle highways that allows people who live in suburban or even beyond to commute into the city, cycling along the Seine, very beautiful and very safe environment. So it could apply to also those people living in suburbs. We have time for a few more questions, and I have an interesting one here from Yue Tongsheng from China, who asks, thank you for the interesting report. My question is this: assume that micromobility, shared bikes, for example, become extremely popular. It will inevitably draw ridership from public transportation. That is what is happening in China. Bus companies already are heavily subsidized, are facing severe financial issues. So what can government and private sectors do, in fact, to maintain, the positive impact of public transport rather than the two cannibalizing each other?
That's an essential question. And one of the policy recommendations that we have been highlighting not only on this report, but in previous publications as well, such as the ITF 2023 Outlook, is that we think in terms of complementarity between public transport and shared mobility. Yes, at some distances, especially at shorter distances, in some contexts, shared mobility is going to be a competition to public transport. But in these distances, we also face situations where public transport is less competitive, but in larger ones, in larger distances, public transport definitely takes the highest share of use. So it's important to use and to think about public transport systems now that we face post-COVID mobility challenges such as lower ridership, in a way that we play out towards the strength of public transport, using it for longer distances and complementing it for with shared mobility if available and possible for shorter ones. Now, another topic that I think it's very important to think about is that shared mobility can be a way to also reach locations in peri-urban areas where it's not necessarily financially sustainable to have public transport, stable public transport connection. And so a complementarity, thinking about multimodal trips between micromobility and then public transport, can be a way as well of reconnecting disconnected places in metropolitan areas. So definitely this is a key question so that we can maintain public transport, but it's important to think of it not as public transport suffering versus micromobility, but rather about how is it that both can complement sustainable transport systems. I don't know if you have anything to
Nothing to add, just like transport centers.
We have 2 more minutes, so maybe time for one more question, and this one is about urban logistics, whether you've also looked into urban logistics, and Berto is particularly interested in those areas of urban logistics that cannot easily be replaced with cargo bikes, like waste collection, construction, and so on and so forth. What did you find out about urban logistics and deliveries?
This is an essential question because indeed the electrification of urban logistics goes in hand on the one hand with using electric cargo bikes where it is that they are attractive, but also with electrifying other vehicles that can cater to other sort of needs. And for this second stage, how to electrify these light commercial vehicles or waste collection materials vehicles, for instance, is essential and has a lot to do with the affordability of these vehicles. Now, we know that the total cost of ownership of these electric vehicles is slowly reaching that of the total cost of ownership of internally combustion engine logistic vehicles. And in some contexts, the cost parity is already there. But the initial acquisition cost and the financing capacity of purchasing these vehicles is not always there, especially because as electric vehicles are emerging, are a new technology, for financial loans, for instance, if an enterprise needs to get a loan to be able to electrify their fleets, this technology might not yet be ready to be funded by banks due to insurance conditions. Authorities, we believe, need to support this financing of electric logistic vehicles so that logistic fleet can be electric. And of course, this is not only for electric cargo bikes.
And maybe just shortly to add, how was this covered into the report, into this study? If I understood that was part of the question. So first to point out that most of the urban deliveries are parcels, right? And parcels are way easier to shift to smaller vehicles. Could be lighter commercial vehicles or any form of micromobility, freight micromobility. But further than that, into the study, we also take into account larger trucks that are not possible to shift to smaller vehicles. And we also account for the fact that these fleets are more difficult to electrify, and therefore have a smaller electric fleet by 2030. So that is into the assumptions and the detailed assumptions within our report if you want to have a further look into it.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you, Joshua. We've reached the end of our 30 minutes that we've allotted ourselves. This is only meant to kind of give you a taste. We know that we cannot answer all the questions in 30 minutes. It's ideally the beginning of a conversation. There's some questions that we haven't been able to answer. I will share with you this afternoon the link to the video recording, so you can send that or colleagues or other interested people along with the email contact of Joshua and Andrea. So if you have questions, you can follow up, because we want this to be something that's starting an engagement and not necessarily just give something to consume and then go away again. We want to have a conversation with you guys. Many of you are in the field and are experts and can contribute to building knowledge in this area and making the world a better place at the end of the day. So that's it for now. Thank you so much. Thank you to our two authors for finding the time and preparing the presentations. Thank you to all of you who participated. You were maybe shocked by the poll that popped up on your window, but thank you for responding. 100% positive response rate, so that's a compliment to our authors and encourages to have more of these. And we hope to see you at the next Ask the Author, which we will inform you about in all kinds of ways in social media and emails and so on and so forth. Thank you for joining us. Have a lovely afternoon, morning, whatever your time zone is, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.